Just want to take a moment and make sure that we're able to connect what's happening in our gathering. You know, if you're watching online and you're just watching the talk later on, or you're listening to the podcast, then we just sang a song called Move Your Heart by Maverick City Music in Upper Room. And we're going to put the lyrics to the first verse back on the screen just to make sure we understand what he's saying. It says this: Jesus, Jesus, precious Lord, there's none on earth or heavens above that I have found more beautiful, that you are my treasure and my great reward. So I just want to move your heart. It's all I want to do. I just want to stand in awe and just pour my love on you, no matter how much the cost. I freely give it all to you. You know, this is the song of Jesus followers. To add some clarity to that, this song declares the mindset and lifestyle of Jesus followers. That, man, we recognize Jesus is our greatest treasure, that he is our reward, that we will never see a being more beautiful than him. And because of that, man, we just want to worship him. We just want to love him. We just want to honor him. Well, it doesn't matter the cost. The cost is irrelevant to just give Jesus the honor and love he deserves. This is a song of Jesus followers. But maybe if you're honest, and if you and I were talking, you would say, Todd, man, that's a cool song. That's not my mindset on Thursday. Or maybe, and just to say this, be honest like that in a setting like this. If you're watching or in the room, don't feel like you can't be honest. Jesus can handle our authenticity. Because maybe what you would say is, man, I love this song in this moment. And in the crescendo, in the decrescendo, for you non-musical people, that means when it gets louder and softer. Man, I'm moved and it's so good. But this song fades by Monday. So how do we shift from a song that fades to a lifestyle that invades every moment of our lives? And if you don't follow Jesus, here's a question for you. What in the world could lead someone to view Jesus like this? What could possibly lead you to view Jesus like this? You know, I think a factor, not the only factor, but a huge factor, is whether or not we believe that Jesus is God. Because if we believe that Jesus is God, then he is our greatest treasure. He is our reward. And just as a side note, if you have a God and that God isn't the greatest treasure and that God isn't deserving of all your worship, then you need to get a new God, because that God is too small. So if Jesus is really God, this will be our mindset and this will be our lifestyle. And that's why we're in the middle of a series asking that very question: is he really God? Because this question matters to us immensely. And if you don't follow Jesus, please notice the intentionality of phrasing this as a statement or as a question rather than a statement. It's a question because we want to invite you to explore Jesus and to wrestle with this question. And for those of us who follow Jesus, hopefully we've been able to establish that this question is very significant in determining whether or not we actually live as Jesus, as our greatest treasure on a Friday, whether or not we actually live as if Jesus is our King. So we're diving into this, and I just want to invite you to continue to go on a journey. And on our journey, our guide is John. John was one of Jesus' closest friends when he was on earth. And when John was an old man, he sat down to write an eyewitness account of Jesus' life. And John lets us know his thesis. In John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, he wants us to know why he wrote. And he says this: "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." What John is saying here is he's saying, hey, I'm writing for purpose. And the purpose is I want to answer the question, is he really God? By giving you a definitive, evidence-based answer that yes, he is the Christ, he is the Son of God, that Jesus is God. That doesn't mean that we don't wrestle. It means that we wrestle with what John says. We wrestle with John's evidence. And in order to understand the argument that John's going to present to us, there's two terms here that we have to define. The first term is sign. A sign directs us to something. The point is not the sign, but it's what the sign is pointing to. In part one of this series, I used the example of driving down the interstate and seeing a Chick-fil-A sign. Now, I know it's Sunday, and this is probably just gonna make you mad, but take a moment and think about your favorite item on the Chick-fil-A menu. And then we're all gonna say that item on three. All right, everybody ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, I'm hearing some spicy chicken sandwich from Randy. I'm with you on that one. Did anybody just be like, like anything, just order something? Is that okay? Yes, I'm with you, Micah. Here's the thing. The point when you see that Chick-fil-A billboard, it's not the sign, it's the spicy chicken sandwich that you're gonna get. So what John does is he's gonna use signs in order to point us to evidence that declares Jesus is God. The point isn't the sign. The point is that John is trying to answer the question and show us that Jesus is God. The other word that we need to understand that he uses here is believe. Because a lot of us have been handed a definition of believe that's divorced from action, and that is not the biblical definition of this word. If we look in the Greek, in the original language, believe infers trust, believe implies action. We're not really believing something unless our actions prove it. And I've said this in week 1, and I'll say it again. We don't really believe that Jesus can save us unless we let him change us. That we don't really believe Jesus can save us unless we let him change us. So part of the heart of this series is to rebrand the word believe. So it's no longer divorced from action, but that we see believe as the action verb that it is in the biblical narrative. So we know John's intentions, and we know that he's going to be our guide. And we understand that this question is very significant, but I also want to invite us to not just show up on Sunday, not just tune in on Sunday to wrestle with this question, but to actually read this eyewitness account called John yourself. In fact, if you're in the room, if you just scan the QR code, if you're at home, if you just download the Public Church app, we have the Knowing Jesus Project, John. And this is a Bible study that equips all of us with both how to study and live Jesus' teachings. In fact, there's some people in our church family that are so authentic that they actually wrote down their time in John for one day and have allowed it to be included in this Bible study as an example for us. So what that means is that for the next 3 weeks of this series, we're going to be talking about, is he really God on Sundays? But I invite you throughout the week to explore that. This is not a Sunday question. This is an everyday exploration of, is Jesus really God? And today, as we dive more into that question, it actually leads us to another question. And the other question is this: how do we define God? Make it personal. How do you define God? When you hear God, what sort of assumptions come to mind? This question matters because John is going to give evidence that Jesus is God. Jesus is going to clearly declare that he is God, yet a lot of people still rejected him as God. Maybe some of us in the room still reject him as God. Why is that? I think one reason is because Jesus didn't match their version of God. That they had a definition of God, we have assumptions about God, and sometimes Jesus doesn't fit that. So how do we define God? In fact, Mark Clark, who grew up in a skeptical home, he was an atheist. As he began to research about Jesus that led him to become a Jesus follower, he wrote a book called The Problem with Jesus. And in this book, Mark actually asked the question of, why is it that people reject Jesus' claims of divinity? And he gives 2 reasons that are going to be on the screen. And he says reason number 1 is simply that they already have an idea of who God is, and they can't fit Jesus into that. Reason number 2, they already have an idea of who Jesus is, and they can't fit God into that. Is that you? Is it me? And Jesus followers, before we dismiss this as a talk for those exploring their faith, and I'm so glad that my friend who doesn't yet follow Jesus is watching this or has snuck into the room. I'm just so thankful. No, this is a question for all of us. Come on, let's be real, Jesus followers. When's the last time that we were reading something that Jesus said or did, we got confused and we just went, not gonna worry about that. And we set it aside. Why do we do that? Because in that moment, Jesus doesn't fit inside our box, our definition of who God is. And the moment that I dismiss who Jesus is in order for who I think God is, now I'm playing God. Now I am the one determining who God is instead of letting Jesus define God. You know, one of the most scandalous aspects of Jesus' ministry is that he was consistently redefining who God is to his audience. And if we let him, that's what he is going to do for us today. So we're going to be in John chapter 9. If you want to join me in your Bible or Bible app. As you go there, as we drop in this scene, his disciples, his followers on earth, they have some assumptions about God. They have a definition of God, and they're going to lay that out. So before we read, I just want to ask this question. What assumptions did you tune into this broadcast? What assumptions did you walk into this room caring about God? And will you, for a few minutes, set those aside in order to explore Jesus' definition of God? That whether or not we follow Jesus, we just for a few minutes say, I'm going to set aside my assumptions and I'm going to explore how Jesus defines God. So before we read, I want to invite us to pray and do just that. And if you're comfortable, whether you're in the room or watching, I just want to invite you to actually physically open your hands as a symbol that just says, Jesus, I'm setting aside my definition and I want to see what you have to say about who God is. So Jesus, we open our hands to you. We open our minds to you, our hearts to you, our lives to you. There may be some fear, some nervousness about whether this is going to affect some plans we have later this week or later this month, but I pray that you would help us just to focus, to lean in, to truly set aside the assumptions that we carried in, and for a few moments to explore how you define God. And as we do that, I ask Jesus that you would redefine God and just show us who you really are. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So in John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, here's what happens. It says, as he, that's Jesus, passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, that word means teacher, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The disciples are asking a question that aligns with ancient theology, the theology of the day. Here was the theology of the day. Bad things happen to people who do bad things. Good things happen to people who do good things. And this is a theology, and these are questions that are still present today. In fact, in my life, these are some questions that I could have been asking at the end of 2021. See, in December of 2021, same month, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and my dad has been diagnosed with a chronic liver disease. So the thought could be, who sinned? Like, did I sin? Did my parents sin? According to this question, did their parents sin? And it's just taken decades for those consequences to roll all down? Because in this question, the word sinned is in the aorist tense. We can think of that as a snapshot. So what they're asking is, what was the snapshot or moment where either this person's parents sinned or this guy sinned, or some rabbis actually believed in prenatal sin. This guy could have sinned when he was in the womb, and in that moment, bam, he got struck with blindness. In that moment, bam, my mom got breast cancer, my dad got chronic liver disease. Who sinned? This is a deeply personal question to me, and I imagine it is for many of you. So here's what Jesus says. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Jesus firmly rejects the theology of his disciples and our theology if we think that the world is set up to where bad things happen to people who do bad things and good things happen to people who do good things. Jesus wants us to understand the world is not a moral slot machine. It's not like we just put in good things and always get out good things, or we put in bad things and we always get out bad things. That's not how the world is set up. I love how N.T. Wright says it. He says, the world is stranger than that and darker than that. And the light of God's powerful, loving justice shines more brightly than that. Man, that is some good news. Now, here's the reality. Sometimes our sin does lead to adversity and to consequences, but we should not assume the connection between sin and sickness. The world's just not that simple. It's stranger. It's darker than that. And the light of God's justice shines brighter than that. So in my situation, it wasn't that my mom sinned or I sinned or my dad sinned. So we live in a broken, fallen world where people get cancer and people get chronic disease. Because here's the flip side of that theology. If we think that bad things caused it, then we think that good things can get us out of it. So praise Jesus, my mom is actually cancer-free. Like we are praising Jesus for that. The doctor said the surgery went absolutely as good as it could. She got her pathology report back. She's cancer-free. My dad still has a long road to walk. So does that mean that my mom did something good and God healed her, and my dad did something bad and God didn't heal him? No, that is not the situation. We need to understand that we didn't sin our way into it and we don't earn our way out of it. Let's say that one more time. We didn't sin our way into it and we don't earn our way out of it. So what Jesus wants to do is he wants to retrain our brains. And to help us do that, the Message paraphrase of verse 3 is extremely beneficial. So if you've not been listening, I encourage you just to lock in and hear and internalize this. Jesus says, you're asking the wrong question. Wow. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause-effect here. Look instead for what God can do. Look, we are so good at trying to assign blame. And Jesus says, instead, let's search for God's glory. Because in this story, the why behind this man's blindness is not God's judgment, it's God's glory. And we see this theme repeated as we're going to read through John together in John 11, verse 4. As one of Jesus' close friends, Lazarus, dies. And they ask Jesus what's going on. And he says his illness is for the glory of God. We are so good at searching for blame. And Jesus says we're asking the wrong question. Why don't we begin to search for glory? And let's just be honest about this. It's really easy to ask a question like this when we're in good health and we're comfortable and nobody can ask this question of us. It's so easy for us to assume the connection in others when nobody can assume the connection with us. But the world is stranger. It's darker than that. And the light of God shines brighter than that. So as I've personally been walking through John, a question I wrote as I read through John chapter 9 is, where am I asking the wrong questions? Specifically to this passage, where am I looking to assign blame instead of searching for God's glory to be revealed? Because in the world we're in, sometimes chronic illness and even death can become platforms for his glory, can become vehicles that God uses to actually drive people to him. So let's start asking better questions. And let's stop searching for blame and start searching for glory. And then here's what Jesus says next in verse 4. He says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. These two verses are one of the reasons that I believe that this is a genuine eyewitness account, because on first reading, it doesn't make any sense. It's like they ask a question, something's going to happen after this, and in the middle of it, it's like Jesus philosophizes or something. It's like, well, what in the world is he even saying? But when we look, what he's saying makes a ton of sense. There's a lot of observations here. One is simply this. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. What he's going to do is then show us what the light of the world does. He's saying, hey, pay attention. I'm the light of the world. If you want to see what the light of the world does, then just watch what happens next. The other observation is Jesus says, we must work the works of him who sent me. The magic's in the details. You notice the grammar? We must work the works of him who sent me. In other words, Jesus invites his disciples then and invites us now to join him in his mission. That we all have a role to play in shining the light of Jesus into a dark world. So I want to speak specifically to those of you who are in high school, who are in middle school, who may be in elementary school. And if your mindset is, you know what, when I get 18, then I'll have a role to play. You know, when I get a little bit older, then Jesus can use me. But not now, I'm too young. No, that is not at all what Jesus is saying. In fact, just a question for you. Who are your friends more likely to listen to talk about Jesus? Me or you? The reality is you. Your friends are more likely to listen to you. So go be an influencer at your homeschool co-op and point people to Jesus. Go be an influencer in your cafeteria at school and point people to Jesus. We all have a role to play no matter the age that we are. And then Jesus goes on with this story, and it says in verse 6, having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. Pause. This is pre-COVID for sure. I mean, definitely pre-COVID. And this is disgusting. I'm like, if I'm the blind guy, I'm like, thankfully I can't see what he's doing because I'm not sure if I could. I want him to heal me. It's like, this is like, it's like, man, I'm not sure I want a piece of this. But actually we need to understand, yes, it's really gross to us. But in this time period, saliva was believed to have ancient healing properties. So I'm so thankful to all our medical people watching and listening and scientists that we've advanced beyond this, beyond believing that if we just spit on somebody, we can help heal them. But anyway, not as weird to them as it is to us. But Jesus anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. There are so many layers to this. Oh, we're just going to look at two simple layers as Jesus says, hey, go wash in the pool of Siloam. The first layer is a question. How did he get to the pool? I mean, this guy's blind, isn't he? So Jesus tells a blind guy to go like over there. How in the world is he going to get over there? You know what's implied? Community. It's implied is that he had people around him who, when Jesus said this, were like, let me grab your arm and let me now walk you over to the pool of Siloam. So we're not going to stay here very long, but a question that we need to ask today is, are we letting people into our brokenness so that they can guide us to the healing Jesus offers? Perhaps we need to look around and go, man, I have isolated myself and I need to unisolate myself and let my community grab my arm and carry me to Jesus so that he can heal me. The second observation is that Jesus tells him to go and wash because sometimes Jesus invites us to participate in our own healing. Now, he doesn't always do this. In John 11, Lazarus, he's dead. He cannot do anything to participate in his own healing. Jesus is like, you just lay right there. That's all you can really do. I'll be here in a minute. I'll take care of that, okay? But sometimes, like in John chapter 5, there's a man who's been an invalid. He's not moved in 38 years because of sickness. And Jesus walks up to him and says, stand up and pick up your mat. There are times that Jesus invites us to participate in our own healing. And this reminds me of some words we landed on in week 1. Some words from Mary, the mother of Jesus, in John chapter 2, verse 5, as she says, do whatever he tells you. That the essence of following Jesus is to do whatever he tells us. So my question for us today is, are we willing to do whatever he tells us to experience healing? Are we willing to do whatever he tells us to experience freedom? Are we willing to do whatever he tells us to experience restoration? Because maybe the one thing between you and your healing today is getting up off your hiney and rising and picking up your mat and walking. It's going to wash in the pool of Siloam, as Jesus says, will you do whatever I've told you? And so he goes and he washes and he comes back seeing. And then the town goes crazy. Verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. Verse 9, it's like, did he have a doppelganger that just showed up? They're like, we think it's him, but no, this person showed up that just looks like him. I mean, this is crazy. And it says, he kept saying, I am the man. Like he had to keep saying this. So verse 10, so they said to him, then how were your eyes open? And he answered him, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes, and it was gross. But he said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I did whatever he told me. He said, so I went and washed and received my sight. And they said to him, well, where is he? And he said, I do not know. And it's at this point that the narrative takes, well, it's really an unexpected turn, because the religious leaders are going to get involved and they're mad. You know, a few weeks ago, Matt Moore gave an incredible talk, and he discussed a scene where Jesus healed someone who was demon-possessed. This person was so demon-possessed, his life was so wrecked and oppressed that they would chain him up and he would just break the chains. And yet Jesus healed him. Yet for the town that they were in, Matt said that the townspeople missed the headline, man is restored, and instead chose the headline, we lost our pigs. In other words, we lost a bunch of money. So in this story, the religious leaders, they miss the headline, the blind man can see, and they choose the headline, we think Jesus is a sinner. Like, whoa, oh goodness, why are we calling Jesus a sinner? He healed somebody. It all revolves around this idea of the Sabbath. And if you read the whole chapter, you see that. So what is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a gift from God. It's permission from God. It's actually God's inviting us to stop working. Because when we stop working, He is God and He holds the world and it keeps going on without us. So we can take a day off. The Sabbath is a gift from God. But what these religious leaders had done is they had taken what God said in the Old Testament based on their culture and their interpretation, they added to it, and then they put more weight on what they had added to God's words than what God actually said. See, Jesus doesn't violate anything written in the Old Testament. Jesus violates what they wrote about what is written in the Old Testament. And what they had done is they had written down their definition, their assumptions about who God is and how God should act, and Jesus is blowing that up. And as a result, in verse 16, it says this, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. He's not keeping their version of the Sabbath. But others said, well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. So what happens when Jesus does or said something that we would label as un-Jesus-like? What happens when Jesus does or said something that we would label as ungodly? Perhaps our definition is wrong because He is God and He is the one writing the definition. But for the Pharisees, they couldn't get to that point. Like, no, you got to fit within our box. You got to fit within our assumption. So like, all right, let's just ask the guy. Verse 17, they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him since he's opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. Pause, we'll come back to that. They don't believe him. They actually don't even believe that it's the right guy, so they bring in his parents. They say, hey, is this your son? And his parents say, hey, he is of age, you ask him. Now, of age means he's at least 13. So middle schoolers, parents, this would be like your kid getting called in the superintendent of the whole school system, being accused of something, and you walk in the superintendent's office and you're like, he's 13, he can speak for himself, I'm out, peace, you know? Like they are just hanging him out to dry here. Why are they doing this? Because they are afraid of the religious leaders. And their fear blinds them from the fact that God is in their midst. They care more about what these religious leaders think than they care about their opportunity to actually encounter God in the flesh. So hey, you just ask him. And so they do ask him. In verse 24, so for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. That phrase, give glory to God, it's basically, in the original language, they're saying, hey, come on, just tell us, like it's a command, make an oath that Jesus is a sinner. And here's what he says. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. I love the simplicity of this. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Like, I'm not sure exactly who this dude really is, but let me tell you, when he touched me, I can see, and I've never been able to see before. I just know that I've been changed by the touch of Jesus. And they are ticked, and you can hear the arrogance dripping from their voice as you drop down to verse 29 as they say, we know. You hear that? Like we know. We're the religious authority. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. Well, the man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. There's some irony and probably sarcasm here. He says, you do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. Here's what we all know. God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. In other words, this guy's saying this is unprecedented. And its unprecedented nature doesn't just mean that God is with Jesus, it means that Jesus is God. And the religious leaders are ticked. Verse 34, they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. At this point in Judaism, there is no doctrine of original sin. They hadn't formed the idea that everyone sinned. So they're not saying, yeah, we're all born in sin. No, what they're doing is they're agreeing with the theology of verses 1 and 2. And they're saying, hey, you're blind because you sinned. And it's clear that you sinned, and we haven't sinned because we're not blind. So you should listen to us. And they cast him out. And at this point, we need to pause and ask this question. Who's been physically absent from the narrative, yet driving it the whole time? Jesus, that's right. On first reading, you might be like, oh man, the blind man's at the center. No. Jesus is at the center of this story. He's physically absent, yet he's driving the narrative. In verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, now before we read what Jesus said, hear this. When religion cast him out, Jesus invited him in. When religion cast us out, Jesus invites us in. And Jesus had this question for him, and he has this question for us. He says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now remember, we're rebranding belief. So he's not saying, hey, do you just think up here that I'm the Son of Man? But are you willing to believe to the point that you trust, that you make Jesus your greatest treasure, that you let the Son of God affect how you live on Wednesday at 3:45? Do you have that kind of belief in the Son of Man? And that's what Jesus is asking us today. And then the blind man replied, I love this. He said, who is he that I may believe in him? He's like, I just want to know who he is. At this point, it's clear that he is trusting Jesus. And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. Jesus says, hey, I know you've never seen before, but right now you are seeing God in the flesh. You are staring right at God as Jesus declares, I am God. And you know what he did? He says, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped. And what that probably means is that he said, Lord, I believe, boom. And he fell on his face before him. Because belief implies action. And that this became the posture of his life. That Jesus, you are God, and you are my King, and I just want you to lead me from here on out. And so what about the Pharisees? Well, Jesus says this statement in verse 39, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Now, in the narrative of John's eyewitness account, it's clear that Jesus' primary purpose in his first coming was not judgment, but it was salvation. But in offering salvation, the people that rejected that salvation are naturally condemned. In offering grace, he had to show people that you're a sinner, and when you choose to reject his grace, then you're choosing to be judged by Jesus. And the Pharisees, they're pretty smart, and some of the Pharisees near him heard these things, like, I think he's talking about us, and so they said, are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. In other words, the Pharisees saw, but they didn't see. They saw everything going on, but they didn't see that according to verse 5, this was the light of the world in their midst. And Jesus, as the light of the world, was not only opening the eyes of the blind physically, he was giving us a chance to have our eyes open spiritually and let his light shine in our unbelief and let his light shine in our darkness. And they saw, but they chose not to see. Because Jesus did not fit into their definition of God. One of the crazy notions of the Christian faith is it's based on this claim by Jesus that to see him is to see God. Just take some time this week and read John 1:18. He said, nobody's seen the Father, but if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so will we let Jesus define God? That's our question for all of us this week. Will we let Jesus define God? Maybe for some of us, it's will we let Jesus redefine God? So no, for me, one of my actions is that as I'm in the Word, as I come across something that Jesus says or that he does, I'm like, oh, that seems like it's not godlike, or that seems like it's not what Jesus would do, that instead of opting out of the tension, I lean into the tension. And my basic thought is, if this doesn't match my definition of God, then my definition of God is off because Jesus defines God. If this doesn't match my version of God, then I need to set that aside and let Jesus show me who God really is. That's what we are invited to do. And for those of us who may be in the room, and if you're like, man, I'm exploring faith. If you're watching, you're like, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around this. I don't yet follow Jesus. Jesus has declared that he is God. And so the question is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to wrestle with it? Will you let his light shine in your darkness? And maybe for some of you, that just means that you actually read John, that you come back next week, that you keep exploring and keep researching who Jesus is. And in that process, I want to make sure that all of us understand that this is a sign. And that the day when Jesus made mud and anointed this man's eyes to heal the blind, Jesus is saying, there's a day coming where I won't just make mud to heal, but I will actually die on the cross to heal. And I won't just be healing physical blindness, I will be bringing light into all the darkness of our lives and healing any type of blindness that we have and offering restoration and forgiveness and freedom to every single one of us. So will you let his light shine in your darkness? Do you want that restoration that he offers? And if you do, you can just talk to Jesus and just tell him. There's no magic words. If you want help with that, man, our prayer teammates are in the back. They would love to have a conversation with you. And even if you just talk to Jesus on your own, I encourage you, before you leave, go to the prayer corner, because we want to make sure that every step of your journey of following Jesus is with someone. We want to be with you every step of the way. And so as public worship comes up to lead us in a couple songs, Jesus followers, here's the question for us. Who are we going to be in this story? The Pharisees or the healed man? Not the blind man. He used to be blind. He's healed. And I point us back to verse 17 so that we can see the development of his faith. We can see that early on, he has no idea who Jesus is. And in verse 17, he's like, okay, I'm seeing more, and I think he's a prophet. And then he gets to a point where he's like, Jesus, you are God. Boom. I just want to worship you. I just want to give you my life, Jesus. So will we let Jesus lead us to that point? May we not be people who saw but didn't see. But may we be people who allow the light of the world to shine the light in the darkness and the gaps in our definition of God, so that Jesus becomes our definition of God. So Jesus followers, wrestle with that. Wrestle with that as we sing, and wrestle with this for as long as you live on this earth. This is a question for us for the rest of our journey. That 40 years from now, as we see something like, this doesn't add up, that we set aside our assumptions and let Jesus define God. And if to continue on that journey today, you just need prayer, or you want to pray by yourself, man, go to the prayer corner, use this time. Because here's the invitation, that just like this man was at the end of the story, that we would all be living lives from this posture. Jesus, I believe that you are God. And because I believe that you are God, I'm gonna get on my knees and I'm gonna let you call the shots and you tell me what to do and you make the decisions. And even when it's uncomfortable, I'm gonna defer to you and push in the uncomfortable because this could be a chance for you to display your glory. Jesus, you're the King. Here is my life. May this be our posture. So Jesus, get us here. And oh, Jesus, keep us here. Oh, I pray for our Tuesdays and Wednesdays, for our Friday nights and Saturday mornings, that we would be found in this posture, Jesus, worshiping you. That every time we brush up against something in your word that doesn't fit our view of you, that we set aside our assumptions. We just follow you, Jesus. May your light shine in our darkness. And may we be people who see and are forever changed by you.